We'll get started. Welcome to Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center's new webinar series. My name is Bruce MacDonald, and I will be hosting the webinar today. So before we begin our session, just a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There'll be a Q&A during the last portion of the webinar. To submit your questions, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging and then Participants and type in your question. You can submit your questions anytime during the webinar. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. So with that, we'll now kick off the discussion. So again, my name is Bruce MacDonald. I'm the President and CEO of Imagine Canada, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the future of social good and some research that Imagine Canada and others have been doing that take a look at the future of giving in this country and how philanthropy is changing. And so really today, this is an invitation for you to find your place in the data. As we've learned at Imagine Canada, it's not really about going around the country and prescribing to people that this is what they should do. In this country, with a multitude of cities, a multitude of organizations, there's not one solution for work in our sector. There's many, many solutions because each community is unique, each organization is different. And what we'll do today is present some data and really at the end, invite you to think about questions that affect your own organizations. Questions to talk about with your boards of directors, with your fundraising teams, and with your staff to see if you mirror some of the trends that are happening nationally. Because if you do, I think that there are some changes coming that our sector really needs to be thinking about because I think the future really does look quite different from the past. So with that, we're going to spend our time today on a report called 30 Years of Giving. This was commissioned by the Rito Hall Foundation. So you may be familiar with them. This is the institution that our former Governor General, David Johnston, created when he in fact was the Governor General, and he is now the board chair of that foundation. And they had an interest in understanding what has been happening over a prolonged period of time as it relates to individual giving in this country. And so they reached out to Imagine Canada. We were the research arm, and together the Rito Hall Foundation and Imagine Canada have made available perhaps the most comprehensive report on individual giving ever done in this country. And so the data sources have been primarily from tax filer information spanning from 1985 to 2014. So this comes from both charity information returns, individual T1 statistics, and then as well, larger scale surveys of individual Canadians ranging from 1997 up to 2013. And these would be things like the General Social Survey on Giving, volunteering, and participating. Imagine Canada has cleaned up the data to make sure that it can be represented as some of the best data possible. So tax shelters have been taken out, duplications have been taken out. So you will hear different numbers from different people at times. We're confident that this is perhaps the most robust examination of tax filer data done, maybe ever, certainly in recent memory. So with that, we'll kind of go through some of the key findings. There are about 6,400 data points in the study. We're only going to tackle a number of those today as we think about what some of the key trends are. So the first thing that's good news is that we live in an incredibly generous nation. Canadians in 2014, we estimate, gave about $14.3 billion in receipted and unreceipted donations to registered charities. So this, again, represents giving by individuals. So not foundations, not corporations, and not government. This is people, citizens, reaching into their pockets and making contributions to organizations. Perhaps the most common number you will hear is 9.6 billion. That doesn't include unreceipted donations. So we've been able to work a methodology so that unreceipted donations are in fact recognized. The other point that I should make in terms of this number is this is to registered charities. So this doesn't count donations to nonprofit organizations, because with the source data being income tax filings and claims, people are not receiving a tax privilege or benefit when they give to a nonprofit organization. That tax privilege is only realized when they give to a registered charity who is authorized to provide a tax-deductible receipt. So, an incredibly generous nation. And in fact, the good news continues to appear. So claim donations, they've increased 150% in real dollar terms since 1984. But you see the first signs of softness in the data, where organizations are relying on an ever-decreasing proportion of the population for those donations. So that's where our starting point is. And now we're going to take a look at some of the main trends from the report. So one is around shifting donation rates and amounts. So starting in 1990, the proportion of tax filers claiming donations began to decline fairly steadily, dropping from a high of 29.5% in 1990 to the current low of just about 21% in 2014. And the way I like to talk about it is think about this. If we only have a third of Canadians who are making contributions and claiming donations, and we lose a third of those, that's a fairly significant decline. So this is one of those findings that, for those of us who lead charitable organizations, makes us a bit nervous, because we do see this incredible generosity, but at the same time, we have to be asking ourselves, why are Canadians not with the same frequency making donations and claiming it on their income tax? So the overall trend is actually quite clear. The donor base is getting even smaller, and changes in donations are now primarily driven by variations in how much people give. So that average gift size is critical in terms of what's happening. And so what's happened here is that the generosity of Canadians has been masking an underlying decline in the number of people giving. So as you can see, from a peak in 1990, the percentage of tax filers claiming donations has dropped by a third, but the average donation claimed has nearly doubled. So whenever we would hear statistics about giving, it was always good news, because in raw dollar numbers, the actual value of donations has continued to rise. What we weren't really understanding was that it was fewer people giving more that was the reason for that continued increase. And so I think that's both a good news and bad news scenario. It's great that people are even more generous than they have been, but at the same time, it's concerning that fewer Canadians aren't making charitable financial gifts. So one of the findings that we found, we call the Great Divide. And what we're finding is that Canadian charities have become more dependent than ever on affluent Canadians. I think for those of you who work in the charitable sector, you'll say, well, this isn't a surprise. We go where the money is. But the extremes are starting to show. In 1984, the top 1% of tax filers, and that was at that time representing people that earned $80,000 and up, accounted for only 16% of donations. Today, or 2014, That same top 1%, now representing those earning $250,000 and up, accounted for 31% of donations. So that same 1% of tax filers has almost doubled in terms of how they represent giving in this country. So a high concentration of giving in the top 1% of tax filers. If there was a couple of standout findings, this next set I think is also critical, something we call the golden years. In 1985, I should say, donors that were 50 years and over accounted for 54% of donations. In 2014, that's increased by 20 points and is now 70% of all donations. So 3/4 of all received donations in this country are coming from people who are 50 years and older. And even more startling is those who are 70. So people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s alone account for 30% of donations. Again, as you can see, almost a doubling, up from about 16% in 1985. And so, a couple of things. One is this is intuitively correct. So as baby boomers and the silent generation have been getting older and moving through the highest earning components of their career and into retirement, they have earned significant wealth throughout their lives, and they are coming from generations who give back. And so this concentration of older, wealthier Canadians is accounting for more and more of the donations. The part that's challenging is that we are concerned that if that 30% of $14.3 billion, which is about $4.3 billion, is not protected in bequests and wills, there is a concern that over the next 10 to 15 years, about $4.3 billion could exit the charitable system. One of the other things that the study looked at was the various generations at the same point in time. So what were the silent generation, boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, etc., all like as donors when they were 30, 40, 50 years of age, wherever we had the data? And what the study told us was that each generation is getting slightly less generous. So right now, there's no evidence to suggest that when the wealth transfers from deceased parent to middle-aged child, that money might not be used to pay off their mortgage, to pay down their own kids' student debt, or it's time to live a little and travel and cottage or new car, those kinds of things. So we do have a conversation coming up about what's going to happen when the most generous citizens who are now already in their 70s, 80s, and 90s pass on, and what happens with that wealth. So it is a time for reflection of the sector. It's time to understand, do the donor bases you have reflect these trends around both concentration of wealth and drawing dollars from significantly older parts of the population? Another finding in the report was what we call the Wonder Women, which is seeing that women are becoming more active as philanthropists. The gap in the donation rate between men and women shrank from a difference of 13 percentage points in 1985 to about 3.7% in 2014. And in fact, the gap between the average donation amount increased, oddly enough, going from $321 to $740. So I think some of the older men are controlling a bit more of the wealth, and as the average gift size goes up, and they're the ones claiming on their income tax, we're seeing this change here. But we are seeing that, there is increases. The absolute value of donations claimed by women has roughly tripled, while the value of donations claimed by men has doubled. We expect this trend of increasing philanthropy by women to continue. In 1985, since 1985 rather, women have been making up an even greater percentage of donors, going from 36% up to 41%. And as we see more women in charge of the household philanthropy budget, outliving their husbands, having wealth transferred from maybe being dually managed in a family to be singly managed where they are the prime decision maker, it is likely that some of these statistics will continue to see a shrinking in difference and more of a sameness. So at one point, we've talked about here the concentration of participation as donors by older adults. So let's look at what's happening at the other end of the continuum, something we call the young guns less in this case. So younger donors, those who are 40 and under, have gone from accounting for 41.6% of donations in 1985 to just 22.1% in 2014. The absolute value of donations from Canadians in all age groups except one has gone up, and that is the value of donations from people under 30 have decreased by 16%. And I think it's important to contextualize this. Our observations are that this is not a reflection that young people aren't generous. We believe this is a reflection on a fundamentally different economic starting point for young people today than their parents and grandparents. So when you think of young people today coming out of post-secondary education with massive student debt loads, they are, particularly if they live in an urban center, spending a disproportionate amount of their income trying to find a place to live, and this idea of lack of permanent work. It's hard to be a monthly mission-based donor when you're going from contract to contract and aren't entirely sure where your future paychecks are coming from. So what we're seeing is a participation of young people in social good, but not necessarily in the classic charitable construct, in the classic charitable donation manner. So whether it's participation through volunteerism, engagement with causes, talking with friends, sharing through social media, and very small donation amounts, young people are participating, but it's not showing up the way it did as donors for their parents and grandparents. So part of the question that we have to ask is, if we have a continuum of donations that has been a steady flow for 30, 40, or 50 years, and it's bulging at one end, and the pipeline has now been reduced to partially a trickle at the other end, what are organizations doing to understand these differences and ensure that the future pipeline actually has dollars still coming in? So as I mentioned, there's over 6,400 data points as part of the study. So just, again, looking at some other trends, very kind of rapid fire findings, just on a wide selection of different data points. From some of the qualitative studies, we were able to see that about a quarter of donors say they're happy with what they have given, but could give more. And this group had the highest average donation of all groups at $749 a year. And so it's interesting. So about 25% of donors are happy, but still have capacity. The good news for organizations is that you already know who they are. They're your highest donors. And it might be worth organizations spending time in a qualitative way to probe with these individuals to understand, do you have 25% in your ranks who are saying, yes, I'm delighted with my gift, but you've never really asked me if I could do any more. And if you do, I might be inclined to give more. Donors who are unhappy with the amounts that they gave and could afford to give more are less engaged with charities and less trusting. So again, I read this as a good news statement in the sense that they've given and they could afford to give more. What this suggests is that donors are saying, or some donors are saying, that we're just not feeling the love from our charitable recipients. And so if time and energy were spent to better engage, report, and steward those gifts, again, there is another cohort of donors who has the capacity to give if we can pivot this unhappiness to a sense of deep satisfaction. We often at Imagine Canada get asked a lot of questions about crowdfunding, and these are harder numbers to get at. We believe that charities raised an estimated $35 million on crowdfunding platforms in 2015. So those are contributions made by individuals on crowdfunding platforms that go to registered charities, so we can track it. What we don't know, however, is how much is going to social causes or issues that aren't registered charities. So for example, if an individual sets up a crowdfunding page to support their aunt that needs a life-saving operation, people will go online, go through the exact same series of steps that they would normally do to give to a registered charity, but they'd give it to an individual or a family. We're not able at this point to track those cause-like things or those mission-like things and how much is being contributed there. In part because most Canadians are giving on crowdfunding platforms that are internationally owned, usually in the US. And so getting Canadian-made data has been challenging or problematic. It also, though, surfaces this interesting paradox or tension in the charitable world. As charities are under unprecedented scrutiny to account for every single dollar that comes in, we have Canadians who are going online and making a donation to an individual or family and never understanding whether the dollars that they provided are in fact being used for the intent for which they gave the gift. In fact, they wouldn't even know if they had an aunt that needed a life-saving operation. So it's an interesting time for charities as we see a societal shift away from trust in institutions to wanting to connect more on a person-to-person basis. So this is one we're continuing to pay attention to and try and see if we can, in fact, get some global data where we can extrapolate some Canadian numbers. One of the other interesting areas, and it's one of those things that Imagine Canada is hoping to do some greater exploration, is really understanding what's happening with new Canadians. And so the 30 Years of Giving study looked at barriers to giving that were cited by immigrants, and we saw two key barriers, two key issues. The first is skepticism about charities and how they use donations, and the second is for charities about how they successfully or don't engage immigrants. And what's interesting too was that this study looked at native-born Canadians, so people like me who were born in this country, naturalized citizens, so people who came from another country and have now taken a citizenship pledge and live here. And the third group was non-citizens, people who have come to this country, are living and working here, but have not yet become Canadian citizens. For me, this was one of the other sort of surprise or standout findings of the study, where we discovered that naturalized citizens are giving more on average than native-born Canadians. And even those who are non-citizens, they are approaching the annual giving of native Canadians. So as we think about a nation that has publicly stated will be welcoming 1 million new immigrants over the next 3 years, the contribution of immigration to our sector is quite profound. And I think as we look at how existing organizations can communicate about the use of donations and find ways to authentically and genuinely build bridges with immigrant communities, there's an opportunity there for fund development growth, for leadership growth, for programmatic change that makes sure that our programs remain current in a changing society. So what does all this mean? And we're going to have lots of time here for kind of conversation and questions. So again, as I sort of kicked off, it's not Imagine Canada's way to preach to organizations, this is what you should do. Rather, what we've chosen to do is frame these as questions. So how can organizations plan for a fiscally sustainable future when their revenue streams are reliant on older mission-based donors? So again, going back to this change, this really significant or seismic shift in the funding landscape that's coming, this sector has had the good fortune to rely on a fairly generous swath of society for a number of generations now. The most generous citizens in our country are now moving into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And many organizations have become very reliant on older, more affluent donors. And that's a good thing because that's where the capacity to give is. At the same time, though, organizational leaders should be, I think, looking at or asking questions about, well, what happens if that changes? If some of our key donors pass on, and if we don't have a planned gift arrangement in place with them, are we in fact building any relationships with their middle-aged children? If we have a donor recognition event or an appreciation event or our annual meeting, are we actually reaching out and inviting the families of those who are associated with our most generous older donors to come and start building an affiliation with the cause and actually understanding the reasons why their parents have been giving to this cause for many, many years? This is one of those areas that data through organizational reflection will be able to say, is our local organizational data mirroring the national trends? And if so, how can we have conversations about this kind of thing? And I think this question spans a little bit more than just this study. As we see organizations in provinces who have had significant provincial government changes, and new leadership at a governmental level that is saying we're going to change the way we look to fund, it's a similar type conversation. It's around fiscal sustainability. And do we have multiple legs of a strong table so that in this case, it could be older mission-based donors. That might change for us in the coming years. In other cases, it could be government dollars that we've relied on for many, many years. The next question is around how can organizations create connection points for young people when cause, not organization, is critical and economic realities may be inhibiting donations. So I sort of alluded to earlier this idea that charity is not necessarily the most appealing or attractive term even for young people. We are witnessing that many young people are interested in participating in societal causes, but aren't wedded to the institution. It is our belief at Imagine Canada that the charitable sector is in fact being caught up in a global anti-institution bias or mindset, where we see citizens of countries who are less trusting in their government leadership, less trusting in their business leadership, and with many charitable organizations having been around for 100 or 150 years, we also fall into the category of institutions, sometimes very large institutions. So it's interesting. I've had some conversations with organizational leaders who say, well, how can we, get young people to be donors? And I think my personal belief is that we might want to reframe the question to around how can we actually engage with young people, recognizing that their economic starting point is so fundamentally different that thinking about them as regular monthly donors might not be in scope of their economic reality. At the same time, though, if we're not building relationships and bridges and demonstrating the impacts of our programs, we don't want an entire generation to go by with no connection to our cause. And then they become at a point in their lives when they do have capacity to give, but have completely missed the connection with our organizations. So I think that it might be that even though this conversation today is based on data related to charitable giving, that the future of connection with young people is not a fundraising conversation, at least to start off with, but it's about an authentic, realistic engagement with young people about the mission, about the cause, about the impact of the program. And sort of to give you an example, and I'll just pick up, say, a health cause. We're hearing now from young people who say, I don't want to support the cancer institution. I want to support people I know who have cancer. And are there ways for organizations to reframe their messaging so that, yes, their organizational work is being supported, but the invitation of the entry point is through effective stories, human interest and real connections where people can make their contributions and feel like they're supporting the actual people who'd be benefiting from the support of the mission or cause. And one of the greatest growth areas that's of potential is how can organizations find ways to invite new Canadians to engage in their cause when their current networks and circles of influence don't include them? I've been someone who's been around the charitable sector for a long time. I go to conferences and meetings. A lot of people look like me. And it's hard for organizations to find new ways to invite people in because you have a tendency, we all do, to go to our existing networks. Well, if our existing networks all look the same, it's difficult to have new people invited into them. I think this also speaks, again, more, this is a deeper conversation than simple philanthropy. I think this is all about, relevancy and connection. And if we think of those two barriers, not being totally sure about how donations are being used, and also not successfully engaging with new Canadians. I had the privilege of leading a national organization where we were starting to become aware that the core offering of one of our programs might not be as culturally relevant in a society where other cultures weren't viewing the program as culturally appropriate. And so we had to start exploring a process of saying, were the core service or programmatic offerings also relevant? Because if they were, or they needed to be changed and adapted, those were then gateways, opportunities for consultation and dialogue, and engagement with leadership of new Canadian communities that would eventually translate into financial support. So there's a lot of information and a lot of data there. The 30 Years of Giving report is a free download available in both English and French off imaginecanada.ca, and or you can get it from the Rideau Hall Foundation website, both an executive version and the full, very long but very interesting version. If you have the time, if you particularly are an organizational leader who is either currently relying on philanthropy, looking at growing your philanthropic programs, or even just getting started, having good data to inform and think about the strategic directions that you would take in building a strong philanthropic base and program. There's a wonderful tool here that can provide you with great food for thought. So with that, I'm going to close the formal part of the presentation, and we have a fair bit of time because my experience has been that the back and forth dialogue is some of the richest conversations. So with that, we'll just kind of open it up to any questions or comments or disagreements. That's always fun, that people might have. And just while people are thinking about it, one of the questions that we are asking through this, particularly as it relates to both older and then potentially new generations of younger donors, is the place of faith in the giving community. In 1965, 50% of Canadians self-identified as attending a place of worship once a week. That percentage is now down to 10%. In some of the other research work that Imagine Canada has done, one of the things that we've heard from philanthropists is that they learned the value of giving from watching their parents and grandparents contribute to church, temple, synagogue, whatever it might be. And so it's interesting as we think about it almost from a training ground or a farm team, a farm system in sports. Where do future generations learn the value of giving if in fact they're not going to places of worship? And we've looked at generosity in families, and we live in a society of almost invisible philanthropy. So just say you're in a traditional family and you've got a busy mom and dad who go online at 10 o'clock at night, kids are in bed, pull out their credit card, make an online gift, which is great. Children in those families don't even realize that they're living in generous families because they don't witness the act of giving. They don't see the generous behavior of their parents because it's done online. Unless there's intentionality around talking about it and ensuring that those kids understand that they're contributing to community, we have some questions about how does that value get passed from generation to generation. I think what's nice is that in a digital world, global realities and needs and access to information is partly offsetting that. Where we see young people today who information is partly offsetting that. Where we see young people today who are very and deeply connected to particularly climate change and issues that affect society because they have access to information so easily. Does it in fact make up for not witnessing acts of generosity on a regular basis? So we haven't had any questions come in at this point. How long do you... Oh, hang on. We got one. Do you know of organizations accessing and having successes with crowdfunding? I don't know of any specifically, but that I'm sort of prepared to name. But we do know organizations who have added this to their suite of fundraising tools and techniques. I had a chance to have a conversation with the owner of a crowdfunding platform. And one of their observations is that crowdfunding is, in a sense, kind of evening out a little bit. When it first came out, there were these stories of individuals with hardships who would put up a crowdfunding page hoping to raise $5,000 and they'd get $500,000. And those are becoming less and less frequent as more people and more organizations start to use this instrument or tool. Their comment to me was crowdfunding platforms are a tool. You know, Canada Helps is a tool. That what they were observing was that most of the dollars that were coming in were still smaller campaigns, generally supported by friends, families, colleagues at work and other areas, but really people connected to the mission or cause. It was just the instrument that was different. So what we're seeing is organizations who are saying, if there's a way for us to experiment or try with showcasing people as the recipients, as opposed to the institution as the recipient, then they're looking at working with crowdfunding sites and platforms. It does feel, though, and certainly the crowdfunding leaders I've spoken with are saying it's still hard work. It's still fundraising, still awareness. People have to know about the causes. And as fewer of them sort of go viral because of these extraordinary natures, it'll be just as hard work as other fundraising initiatives. And the other part is it's kind of the Wild West. And so given that there's little or no regulation for individuals who put up a crowdfunding page and seek solicitation, we are starting to witness the emergence of scams. And so the question will be, is there a critical mass of those that sort of turns people off the use of crowdfunding from a cause or social area? Because most of the money that's raised on crowdfunding platforms are for businesses. But right now, it's still growing. So, it's certainly one of those things for organizations to take a look at. Does it make sense to add this to our suite of fundraising instruments? I hope that helps. Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap things up. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. As I said, if you would like a copy of the study, just go to imaginecanada.ca. It's available in both English and French, or you can get it from the Rideau Hall Foundation. You'll also find other resources, reports from our chief economist, and things like that might inform your work. So with that, have a great day.